The golden sunset painted Greenwich, Colorado in hues of amber and crimson as Rebecca Harper stood on the makeshift stage in the Golden Horn Saloon. Her slender frame was draped in a simple blue dress, her best and only presentable garment that had seen better days. At 22, she possessed a quiet beauty that even the harsh circumstances couldn't diminish. Auburn hair pulled back in a practical knot, clear green eyes that revealed intelligence beyond her years, and a composure that spoke of inner strength. But tonight, that composure was being tested as never before. $500, gentlemen, Luther Blackwood announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowded saloon. The banker's expensive suit and gold watch chain gleamed in the lamplight as he gestured toward Rebecca. That's the debt owed by the late Professor Harper, and that's what his daughter stands to settle today. Rebecca kept her gaze fixed on a point above the crowd, refusing to acknowledge the hungry stares of the men gathered before her. 3 weeks ago, she had been the daughter of a respected scholar. Now she was property to be auctioned. "A educated lady," Blackwood continued, a smile playing at the corners of his thin lips. "Can read, write, keep accounts, strong constitution. Nursed her father through consumption without catching it herself. A valuable acquisition for any household." The words burned in Rebecca's ears, but she maintained her dignified silence. In her mind, she could still hear her father's raspy voice from his deathbed. "I'm sorry to leave you with this burden, my dear. Promise me you'll find a way to settle our debts honorably." She had promised, never imagining it would come to this. "Do I hear an opening bid?" Blackwood asked, surveying the room with the practiced eye of an auctioneer. 200, called a voice from the back. 250, countered another. Rebecca's hands trembled slightly beneath the folds of her skirt, but her face remained impassive. As the bids climbed higher, memories of her father flashed before her eyes. Professor William Harper bent over ancient texts, enthusiastically lecturing to his students, his eyes crinkling with laughter as he shared a passage from his beloved Shakespeare. 400, a gravelly voice announced, pulling Rebecca back to the present. Silas Winters stepped forward into the lamplight, a burly man with small, close-set eyes and hands calloused from labor, but not from honest work. He assessed Rebecca with undisguised avarice. $400 for the professor's daughter, he repeated, louder this time. 450, called another voice, but the crowd was thinning as the price climbed. 480, Winters countered, a triumphant gleam in his eye. Blackwood glanced around the room. 480 once. Rebecca's heart hammered in her chest, but she refused to close her eyes. She would face whatever came with the same dignity her father had taught her. 480 twice. 600. The quiet voice from the corner of the room silenced the crowd. Heads turned as a tall figure emerged from the shadows. The stranger's face was partially obscured by the brim of his hat, but as he stepped forward, Rebecca caught her first clear glimpse of him. He was perhaps in his early 30s, with features weathered by sun and wind, but undeniably handsome. His clothes were of good quality, but practical. A dark coat over a simple white shirt, well-worn boots that had seen many miles. But it was his eyes that captured Rebecca's attention. Steel gray and penetrating, they held a depth of experience that belied his relatively young age. $600, the stranger repeated, his gaze never leaving Blackwood's face. The banker's smile faltered. "Mr. Reed, Mason Reed." Blackwood recovered quickly. "Mr. Reed offers $600, gentlemen. That's well above the debt owed. Any higher bids?" Winters glared at the newcomer, his face flushing with anger, but he remained silent. The other men shuffled their feet, unwilling to match such a sum. "Very well. 600 once, twice." Blackwood's gavel struck the makeshift podium. "Sold to Mr. Reed for $600. As Mason approached to pay, Rebecca finally allowed herself a trembling breath. She had been spared Winters, at least. But what fate awaited her with this stranger? Mason counted out gold pieces into Blackwood's eager hands, then turned to Rebecca. For the first time, their eyes met directly. Rebecca expected to see the same possessive gleam she'd witnessed in Winters' gaze, but instead found something unexpected. Compassion, perhaps, or at least respect. "Miss Harper," he said with a slight nod, "if you're ready, we should leave." His voice was deep and measured, with the faintest hint of an Eastern accent. Rebecca straightened her shoulders and stepped down from the stage, conscious of every eye in the saloon following her movements. She felt Mason's hand hover near her elbow, not quite touching her, but prepared to steady her if needed, a courtesy she hadn't expected. They walked in silence through the saloon, past tables of men who watched with curiosity or disappointment. At the door, Winters blocked their path, his bulk imposing in the narrow space. "Quite the gentleman, aren't you, Reed?" he sneered, "paying double what the girl's worth." "Step aside, Mr. Winters," Mason replied, his voice quiet but firm. "I wonder if she knows what you paid for," Winters continued, ignoring the request. "What services you'll be expecting?" Rebecca tensed, but Mason remained calm. "The only service I expect is civility, which is clearly in short supply here." He shifted slightly, positioning himself between Rebecca and Winters. "Now, if you'll excuse us." Something in Mason's stance must have conveyed more than his words, for Winters hesitated, then grudgingly stepped aside. "Your loss," he muttered. "When you tire of playing gentleman, she'll still be damaged goods." Rebecca felt a flush of humiliation color her cheeks, but Mason guided her past without acknowledging the taunt. The night air was cool and sweet after the stifling atmosphere of the saloon, and Rebecca inhaled deeply, trying to still her racing heart. Mason led her to where a sturdy bay horse was tethered. Only when they were some distance from the saloon did he finally speak. "Miss Harper," he began, his tone gentle but formal, "I want to make something clear. What happened in there? That's not what this is." Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "What is it then, Mr. Reed? You paid $600 for me. Most would say that gives you certain rights." Mason shook his head. "I paid to ensure you wouldn't fall into Winter's hands, not to claim any rights over you." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small pouch. "I'm offering you a choice. In this pouch is enough money for passage on the stage to Denver, or wherever else you might wish to go. It's yours if you want it." Rebecca stared at him in disbelief. "And the alternative?" "I own a ranch about a day's ride north of here, Evergreen. I need someone to help with the household. It would be respectable employment with fair wages and your own quarters." He held her gaze. "The choice is yours, Miss Harper. Freedom to go where you please, or a position at my ranch." "Why would you do this?" Rebecca asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. "Why help a stranger at such cost?" A shadow crossed Mason's face. "Let's just say I know what it's like to lose everything." He glanced away, then back at her. "You don't have to decide immediately. We can find you lodging in town tonight if you prefer." Rebecca considered her options. She had no family to turn to, no friends close enough to help. Denver might offer opportunities, but she would arrive alone and virtually penniless once the stage fare was paid. The ranch, at least, offered immediate shelter and employment. "I'll accept the position at your ranch," she said finally. "Though I want it understood that I intend to work for my keep, I won't be indebted to anyone again." Mason nodded, a hint of approval in his expression. "Fair enough. We'll leave at first light tomorrow." He hesitated. "Unless you'd prefer to depart tonight, Greenwich might hold unpleasant memories." Rebecca glanced back at the Golden Horn, where lamplight spilled from the windows and the sounds of revelry had resumed. How quickly they had moved on, these men who had been bidding for her moments ago. "Tonight," she agreed. "I have nothing to stay for." They mounted Mason's horse, Rebecca sitting sideways in front of him, maintaining as much propriety as the circumstances allowed. As they rode out of town, the lights of Greenwich diminished behind them, and Rebecca felt a weight lifting from her shoulders with each hoofbeat. They rode in silence for a time, the moon rising to illuminate the rolling hills and distant mountains. Mason was respectful of her space, keeping his arms on either side of her only as necessary to hold the reins. After an hour of riding, they crested a hill that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. Mason drew the horse to a halt, allowing them both to take in the breathtaking vista. The moonlight silvered the landscape, transforming ordinary fields and forests into something magical and serene. Rebecca closed her eyes, feeling the cool night air on her face. For the first time in months, since her father had first fallen ill, she felt a sense of peace. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight she was free of Blackwood, of Winters, of the suffocating walls of the cottage where she had watched her father waste away. When she opened her eyes, she noticed Mason watching her, a thoughtful expression on his face. He quickly looked away, but not before Rebecca caught a glimpse of something in his eyes. Not pity, which she would have resented, but a kind of understanding. As they resumed their journey, Rebecca observed her rescuer more carefully. Despite his quiet demeanor, there was a watchfulness about him, an awareness of their surroundings that spoke of experience beyond ranching. She noticed, too, the antique pocket watch he carried, his fingers occasionally brushing its surface in what seemed an unconscious gesture. "Your ranch," she ventured after another stretch of silence. "You mentioned it's called Evergreen?" Mason nodded. "It's modest compared to some, but it's good land. 200 acres, mostly grazing for cattle. The house is solid, 2 stories, built by the previous owner with an eye for comfort rather than ostentation." "And you've lived there long?" "3 years," he replied. "Before that he paused, "back east." Rebecca sensed his reluctance to elaborate and didn't press. They all had stories they preferred not to share. Hers was now written across the gossip of Breenage. She would not demand his in return. By the time they reached Evergreen Ranch, dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon. The first golden rays revealed a picturesque setting, a large white farmhouse nestled among cottonwood trees, with a red barn and several outbuildings arranged nearby. Beyond stretched fenced pastures where cattle grazed, and further still, the foothills rose toward distant mountains. As they approached, Rebecca saw smoke rising from the chimney, suggesting someone was already awake inside. Mason confirmed her thought. "That'll be Abigail Cooper, my housekeeper. She rises with the sun, no matter the season." They dismounted in the yard, Rebecca's legs stiff after the long ride. Mason led his horse to the water trough, then gestured toward the house. "Come, I'll introduce you." The front door opened before they reached it, revealing a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked dark hair pulled into a practical bun. Abigail Cooper had the weathered face of someone who had spent a lifetime in the Colorado sun, but her brown eyes were sharp and assessing as they took in Rebecca's appearance. "Mr. Reed," she said, her tone indicating this unexpected arrival required explanation. "Mrs. Cooper," Mason replied evenly. "This is Miss Rebecca Harper. She'll be joining our household as an assistant." Abigail's eyebrows rose slightly, but she offered Rebecca a nod. "Miss Harper, you must be exhausted after traveling through the night. Come in, I've just put coffee on the stove." The interior of the house was modest but comfortable, with solid furniture and simple decorations. The parlor opened to a dining area and kitchen beyond, where the aroma of fresh coffee and baking bread created a welcoming atmosphere. "Sit, both of you," Abigail instructed, gesturing to the kitchen table. "Breakfast will be ready shortly." As she bustled about preparing the meal, Mason explained Rebecca's situation in brief, tactful terms, that her father had recently passed, leaving debts that Blackwood had called due. "Blackwood," Abigail sniffed disapprovingly. "That man's been a plague on Breenage since he took over the bank. Your father was a professor, you say?" Rebecca nodded. "He taught literature at several colleges back east before his health began to fail. We moved west hoping the air would improve his condition." "A learned man," Abigail said with respect. "We could use more of those in these parts." As they spoke, the back door opened and an elderly man entered, removing his hat as he stepped inside. Tall and lean, with a face creased by decades in the sun, he carried himself with the straight-back dignity of a former soldier. "Josias 18, Mason greeted him. "Good morning." "Mr. Reed," Josiah Miles nodded, then noticed Rebecca. "Ma'am," he added with a slight bow. "Josiah Miles, my ranch manager," Mason explained. "Josiah, this is Miss Rebecca Harper. She'll be assisting Mrs. Cooper with the household." Understanding passed between the two men, and Rebecca realized that Mason must have earned considerable loyalty from his staff for them to accept his decisions without question. After breakfast, Mason showed Rebecca to her room on the second floor, a pleasant space with a comfortable bed, a small dresser, and a rocking chair positioned near the window that overlooked the mountains. Most importantly, the door had a sturdy lock. "I'll have fresh water brought up so you can refresh yourself," Mason said. "Rest today. Tomorrow is soon enough to discuss your duties." As he turned to leave, Rebecca called after him. "Mr. Reed?" He paused at the doorway. "Thank you," she said simply. Mason nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Get some rest, Miss Harper." Left alone, Rebecca surveyed the room that would now be hers. After weeks of uncertainty, the simple security of a door that locked and a bed that was hers alone seemed an unimaginable luxury. She crossed to the window, gazing out at the sun-drenched landscape of Evergreen Ranch. A day ago, she had been preparing to be sold to the highest bidder. Now she stood in a clean private room, employed rather than owned. The suddenness of the change left her dizzy with relief and lingering disbelief. Yet questions remained. Why would a single man like Mason Reed own such a large house? What had brought him from the east to this remote corner of Colorado? And most puzzling of all, why had he spent $600 to rescue a stranger? As exhaustion finally overtook her, Rebecca sank onto the bed. Whatever Mason Reed's motivations might be, for now she was safe. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but today that knowledge was enough. The next week passed in a blur of adjustment as Rebecca settled into life at Evergreen Ranch. Each morning she rose early to help Abigail with breakfast for Mason and the ranch hands. The days were filled with household tasks, cleaning, mending, preserving fruits and vegetables from the kitchen garden that Abigail maintained with pride. Rebecca threw herself into the work, grateful for the routine and the simple dignity of earning her keep. She learned that Mason employed 4 ranch hands besides Josiah, who lived in a bunkhouse near the barn. They were respectful men who tipped their hats when they saw her, but otherwise kept their distance. Abigail proved to be a fair taskmaster, demanding but not unreasonable. As they worked side by side, the older woman gradually revealed snippets of information about her employer. "Mr. Reed bought this place 3 years ago," she told Rebecca as they hung laundry in the yard. Previous owner was retiring, moving to San Francisco to live with his daughter. Place needed work, but Mr. Reed saw its potential. "He seems young to own such a substantial ranch," Rebecca observed carefully. Abigail nodded. "He came with money, that one. Was a doctor back east, so I understand. Doesn't talk about it much." A doctor. That explained the educated manner, the books Rebecca had glimpsed in his study. But not why he had abandoned medicine for ranching in Colorado. "And you, Mrs. Cooper? Have you been at Evergreen long?" "Came with the property," Abigail said with a chuckle. "My husband was foreman here for 20 years before the fever took him. Mr. Reed kept me on when he bought the place. Said a house this size needed a proper housekeeper." During those first days, Rebecca saw little of Mason himself. He left early each morning to work with the cattle or ride the boundaries of his property, often returning only for the evening meal. When present, he was unfailingly polite but reserved, retreating to his study after dinner with account books or correspondence. On the 5th day, Rebecca discovered the library. She had been cleaning the rarely used formal parlor when she noticed a door left slightly ajar. Curious, she peered inside to find walls lined with bookshelves, comfortable chairs positioned near a stone fireplace, and a large desk by the window. The collection was impressive: medical texts and scientific journals, history and philosophy, and a substantial section of literature. Shakespeare, Dickens, Austen, and dozens more. Rebecca's heart quickened at the sight. Since her father's death, she had been without books, a deprivation almost as painful as grief itself. She was examining a volume of Tennyson's poetry when a voice behind her made her jump. "You're welcome to borrow anything that interests you." Rebecca turned to find Mason watching her from the doorway, his expression thoughtful rather than angry at her intrusion. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to pry." "It's not prying to appreciate books," he replied, entering the room. "They're meant to be read, not simply displayed." He crossed to the shelf she had been examining and ran his fingers along the spines. "Your father was a professor of literature, you said. You must have grown up surrounded by books." "We did," Rebecca admitted, the memory both sweet and painful. "Even when we had little else, there were always books. Our cottage in Greenwich was small, but Father's collection filled every available space." Mason selected a volume and handed it to her. "Tennyson was a favorite of yours?" "Of my father's," she said, accepting the book. He would read Ulysses aloud when he was feeling particularly restless. To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Something like approval flickered in Mason's eyes. A worthy philosophy. An awkward silence fell between them, broken when Abigail called Rebecca's name from elsewhere in the house. "I should go," Rebecca said, placing the book back on the shelf. "Take it," Mason insisted. As I said, you're welcome to borrow anything here. Knowledge shouldn't sit gathering dust. After that day, a new pattern emerged. Rebecca began taking her evening meals with Mason and Abigail in the dining room rather than the kitchen. The conversation was initially stilted, but as days passed into weeks, a cautious rapport developed. Mason, she discovered, possessed not only medical knowledge, but a breadth of learning that rivaled her father's. He could discuss Byron's poetry, the latest scientific discoveries, or the political situation in Europe with equal facility. Yet he never spoke condescendingly to her or appeared surprised at her own education, unlike many men who assumed a woman's intellect inferior by nature. Gradually, Rebecca began to see beyond Mason's reserved exterior to glimpses of the man beneath. He treated his ranch hands fairly, paying above the going rate and ensuring injured workers received care. Though not demonstrative, he showed consideration in small ways, remembering that Abigail's joints troubled her in damp weather, or that Josiah's grandson was studying to be a surveyor, inquiring after his progress. One evening, nearly a month after her arrival at Evergreen, Rebecca accompanied Abigail to Greenwich for supplies. As they loaded their purchases into the wagon, Rebecca became aware of whispers and stares from townspeople passing by. "Pay them no mind," Abigail muttered, noticing her discomfort. Small minds breed small talk. But the whispers followed them, and Rebecca caught fragments that made her cheeks burn with shame. Living in sin. Bought her like cattle. No better than she should be. As they prepared to depart, a well-dressed woman approached, her expensive gown and elaborate hat marking her as one of Greenwich's elite. Behind her trailed a younger woman, perhaps 25, with similar features that identified her as a daughter. Mrs. Cooper, the older woman, greeted Abigail with a nod that managed to be both polite and condescending. "How rustic to see you in town." "Mrs. Fletcher," Abigail returned evenly. "Miss Fletcher." Mrs. Fletcher's gaze shifted to Rebecca, assessing her from head to toe. "And this must be the young woman staying at Evergreen. Harper, isn't it?" Rebecca straightened her spine, refusing to be cowed. "Yes, Rebecca Harper." "Margaret Fletcher," the woman introduced herself, making no move to offer her hand. "And my daughter Elizabeth. We're neighbors of Mr. Reed, in a manner of speaking. Our estate lies about 5 miles east of Evergreen." "How do you do?" Rebecca replied with formal politeness. "Indeed." Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes. "One does wonder how you are doing, living as you are without proper chaperonage. It's most unusual for a young woman of your background." The implication was clear, and Rebecca felt heat rise in her face. Before she could respond, Abigail stepped forward. "Miss Harper is employed at Evergreen as my assistant," she said firmly. "Her reputation is above reproach, as is Mr. Reed's." Margaret's eyebrows rose. Of course, one simply worries about appearances, particularly given the circumstances of her arrival." "If you'll excuse us," Abigail cut in, "we should return before dark." As they drove away, Rebecca's hands trembled with a mixture of humiliation and anger. "Does everyone in town know?" "Greenwich has few entertainments beyond gossip," Abigail sighed. "But it will pass. Some new scandal will replace it soon enough." Mrs. Fletcher seemed particularly interested in my situation. Abigail snorted. "Margaret Fletcher has been trying to secure Mr. Reed for her daughter since he arrived in the territory. She considers Elizabeth a perfect match. Young, pretty, and from one of the wealthiest families in the county." "And Mr. Reed?" "Declined her not-so-subtle invitations repeatedly. The woman simply cannot fathom why." Rebecca absorbed this information in silence. She had never considered Mason's life beyond the ranch. Whether he had turned down Elizabeth Fletcher out of disinterest in marriage generally or in Elizabeth specifically. "Mrs. Fletcher also mentioned," she said carefully, "that there's been someone asking about me in town." Abigail glanced at her sharply. "What sort of someone?" "She didn't say. Just that a man was making inquiries about the Harper girl." The housekeeper frowned. "We should tell Mr. Reed when we return." Rebecca nodded, unease settling in her stomach. Who would be looking for her? She had no family left, no connections beyond Greenwich. Unless, a cold thought struck her, unless Silas Winters hadn't accepted his loss as gracefully as it appeared. When they returned to the ranch, Mason was waiting on the porch, his expression concerned. "You are later than expected," he said. helping Abigail down from the wagon. Took longer than anticipated, Abigail replied, then lowered her voice. And we had an encounter with Margaret Fletcher. Mason's face darkened slightly. I see. She mentioned someone's been asking after Miss Harper in town. At this, Mason turned to Rebecca, his eyes intent. Did she say who? No, just that a man was making inquiries. Mason helped her down from the wagon, his hand steady on her arm. I'll look into it, he promised. As they walked toward the house, Rebecca noticed his fingers brushing the pocket where he kept his watch. That unconscious gesture she had observed before. Whatever his thoughts might be, they troubled him enough to seek the comfort of that familiar object. That night after dinner, Mason invited Rebecca to join him in the library. The late September evening had turned cool, and a small fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light over the book-lined walls. I wanted to speak with you about what Mrs. Fletcher said today, Mason began, indicating that Rebecca should take one of the armchairs while he remained standing near the fireplace. I'm sorry you were subjected to her insinuations. It's not your fault, Rebecca replied. People will talk regardless. Perhaps. He paced a few steps, then turned back to her. But I never intended for my actions to cause you further difficulty. When I intervened that night at the Golden Horn, I didn't consider how it might appear. Would you have preferred not to intervene? Rebecca asked quietly. Mason's gaze was steady. No, I would make the same choice again, but I regret any additional burden my decision has placed on you. Rebecca studied him in the firelight, this man who had saved her from a fate she still couldn't bear to contemplate fully. Why did you do it, Mr. Reed? The truth this time. For a long moment, Mason was silent, his expression guarded. Then with a sigh, he sank into the chair opposite hers. I knew your father, he said finally. Rebecca stared at Mason, her mind struggling to process his words. You knew my father? How was that possible? Mason's fingers brushed the pocket watch he carried, a gesture that now took on new significance. With deliberate movements, he withdrew the timepiece and held it in his palm, the gold catching the firelight. This was a gift from him, Mason said softly. Years ago, when I was a much younger man. He opened the case, revealing an inscription inside. For William, the man who saved my life, J.H. Beside the inscription was a small, faded photograph of a younger man that Rebecca instantly recognized. That's my father, she whispered, leaning forward. When he was teaching at Columbia. Her eyes darted back to the inscription. But who is J.H.? Jonathan Hayes, Mason replied. My uncle and guardian after my parents died. He was a wealthy businessman in Boston with a penchant for attributing to me things I hadn't done. A shadow crossed his face. Your father saved my life, not the other way around. Rebecca's mind raced. I don't understand. How did you meet? Father never mentioned. It was during the diphtheria outbreak in Boston, 1868, Mason explained. I was a medical student at Harvard. Despite precautions, I contracted the disease while treating patients at Massachusetts General. He paused, his gaze distant with memory. Your father was visiting my uncle on academic business. He'd studied some experimental treatments in Europe. When the hospital doctors gave up on me, William Harper didn't. Rebecca remembered her father's extensive knowledge of medicines, his collection of medical texts alongside his beloved literature. He had always maintained an amateur's interest in healing arts. He stayed in Boston for weeks, Mason continued, administered treatments, read to me when I was too weak to hold a book. By all medical expectations, I should have died. Instead, I recovered. One of the few who did. Rebecca found herself blinking back tears. This was the father she remembered, selflessly devoted to others, passionate about knowledge that could make a difference. My uncle was grateful, Mason said, gave him this watch, established a scholarship in his name. He closed the case gently. William and I corresponded for years afterward. He helped guide my medical education, encourage my practice. When letters from him became infrequent, I grew concerned. I tried to find him, but you'd moved often. Father's health was declining, Rebecca said softly. We kept moving west, seeking better air, more affordable accommodations. Mason nodded. By the time I traced you to Greenwich, it was too late. He had already passed, and you, his jaw tightened. You were being auctioned like property. The pieces began to fall into place for Rebecca. Mason's timely arrival in Greenwich, his willingness to pay far more than the debt required, his offer of employment rather than ownership. You felt you owed him a debt, she said, understanding dawning. You were repaying him by helping me? Something flickered in Mason's eyes. Discomfort, perhaps, or uncertainty. Initially, yes, he admitted. I came to Greenwich intending to help William Harper in whatever way he needed. Finding you in that situation, it seemed the only honorable course. Rebecca withdrew slightly, a chill replacing the warmth she had begun to feel. So this, the position, the kindness, it's been obligation all along. No, Mason said quickly, then more measured. Not only obligation. He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking less composed than Rebecca had ever seen him. I respected your father greatly, but the woman I've come to know these past weeks, her intelligence, her dignity, her determination, those qualities have earned my admiration in their own right. Before Rebecca could respond, a sharp knock sounded at the door. Abigail entered, her expression troubled. Mr. Reed, sorry to interrupt, but there's a storm brewing, something fierce. Josiah's concerned about the new calves in the north pasture. Mason rose immediately. I'll help him move them. He glanced at Rebecca, regret in his eyes at their interrupted conversation. We'll speak more later. Rebecca nodded, still processing everything she'd learned. As Mason left with Abigail, she remained by the fire, staring at the flames. Her father had saved Mason Reed's life, and now Mason had saved hers, a circle of debt and gratitude spanning years. But was that all it was? The thought left an unexpected ache in her chest. Rebecca woke to the sound of torrential rain hammering against her window. The early morning light was dim and gray, filtered through low-hanging storm clouds. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, where she found Abigail in the kitchen, her expression worried as she peered out the window. They've been out all night, the older woman said without preamble. Mr. Reed, Josiah, and the hands, trying to get the cattle to higher ground before the creek floods. Rebecca joined her at the window. Beyond the yard, she could see the normally tranquil creek had transformed into a churning, muddy torrent that threatened to overflow its banks. The rain showed no sign of abating. Is there anything we can do? She asked. Abigail nodded briskly, seemingly relieved to have tasks to focus on. Prepare food and coffee for when they return, and gather bandages and medicines. There's always injuries in weather like this. They worked in tense silence, preparing a hearty stew that could be kept warm indefinitely and baking fresh bread. Rebecca assembled medical supplies from the cabinet where Mason kept such items, noting with interest the professional quality of the instruments and medicines, remnants of his days as a physician. By mid-morning, the first of the ranch hands returned, soaked to the skin and exhausted. He reported that the herd was safe on higher ground, but Josiah, Mason, and two others were still searching for calves that had been separated from their mothers. As the day wore on, more men returned in similar states, cold, wet, and weary. Rebecca helped Abigail tend to minor injuries and ensure the men had hot food before they collapsed into sleep in the bunkhouse. It was late afternoon when Josiah finally returned with one of the hands. The elderly ranch manager looked every one of his 70 years as he slumped at the kitchen table, accepting a steaming cup of coffee from Abigail. Mr. Reed? Rebecca asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. Josiah's weathered face was grim. Still out there. Young calf got trapped in the mud near the old sycamore. Creek's rising fast in that area. And you left him alone? Rebecca couldn't keep the accusation from her tone. He ordered us back, Josiah replied, not offended by her sharpness. Said no sense in all of us risking ourselves for one calf. Rebecca moved toward the door, grabbing her shawl from its hook. Abigail caught her arm. You can't go out in this, girl. You wouldn't even know where to look. The old sycamore, Rebecca replied. That's where Josiah said he was. It's 2 miles through woods and fields that are half underwater by now, Josiah protested, and dark's coming soon. Then I'd better hurry, Rebecca said, her jaw set in determination. Before either could protest further, the back door burst open. 2 ranch hands staggered in, supporting between them a third figure. Mason, barely conscious, his clothes caked with mud and his face alarmingly pale. Found him downstream, one of the men gasped. Creek bank gave way. Looks like he got kicked by the calf he was trying to save. Rebecca rushed forward, helping them guide Mason to a chair. His breathing was labored, and he winced when they lowered him. "Get him upstairs to his room," she instructed. "We need to get him out of these wet clothes before pneumonia sets in." With the men's help, they managed to get Mason upstairs and into dry clothes, though he remained only semi-conscious throughout the process. When they laid him in his bed, Rebecca examined him with practiced hands, recalling what she had learned from nursing her father and from medical texts. "Broken ribs," she announced, feeling the unnatural give beneath her fingers on his left side. "And his breathing concerns me. There may be water in his lungs." She worked efficiently, binding his ribs and preparing a mustard plaster for his chest. Abigail assisted silently, seemingly impressed by Rebecca's calm competence in the crisis. "He's burning with fever," Rebecca said, placing a hand on Mason's forehead. "We need to bring it down." Through the night, she sat by his bedside, applying cool cloths to his forehead and monitoring his breathing. At times he thrashed in fevered dreams, muttering incoherently. Once he called out a name, William, and Rebecca wondered if he was dreaming of her father. In the small hours of the morning, as rain continued its relentless drumming on the roof, Mason's pocket watch slipped from the nightstand where they had placed it with his other effects. It fell with a soft thud on the rug beside Rebecca's chair. She picked it up, intending to return it to the table, but paused to look at it more carefully in the lamplight. The gold case was scratched from years of use, but had been well maintained. She opened it, revealing the inscription she had seen earlier and the small photograph of her father. As she was about to close it, she noticed what appeared to be a seam in the inner case. Curious, she pressed it gently, and a hidden compartment sprang open. Inside was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Glancing at Mason to ensure he remained asleep, Rebecca carefully unfolded it. It was a letter written in her father's distinctive handwriting. "My dear Mason, I write with heavy heart to request your assistance. My health fails rapidly, and I fear for Rebecca's future. The investments I made have proved disastrous, and debts accumulate that I cannot hope to repay in my remaining time. I would not ask, but I have exhausted all other resources. If you can find it in your heart to help, as I once helped you, I would be forever grateful. Any sum you might spare would ease my mind regarding my daughter's fate that after I am gone. Your friend always, William Harper." The date on the letter was just 3 months before her father's death. Rebecca's hands trembled as she refolded it and returned it to its hiding place. Her father had reached out to Mason for help, and Mason had come, but too late. The realization brought fresh tears to her eyes. Her proud, dignified father reduced to begging for assistance in his final days. And Mason, carrying not only the weight of a life debt, but also the guilt of arriving too late to repay it. Mason stirred, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment, he seemed disoriented. Then his gaze focused on Rebecca. "The calf?" he rasped. Rebecca almost laughed through her tears at his first concern being for the animal. "Safe, from what I understand. You're the one who nearly drowned." He tried to shift position and winced. "Feels like it." "3 broken ribs," Rebecca informed him. "And you've been feverish for hours. The creek bank collapsed?" Mason nodded weakly. "Should have seen it coming. Rookie mistake." "A mistake that nearly cost your life," Rebecca admonished, reaching for the cup of willow bark tea she had prepared earlier. "Here, drink this. It will help with the pain and fever." Mason grimaced at the bitter taste but drank obediently. "You've been here all night?" "Someone needed to make sure you kept breathing," she replied, attempting lightness despite her exhaustion. His eyes, still fever-bright, studied her face. "Thank you." The simple gratitude in his voice touched something in Rebecca, and she found herself blinking back fresh tears. "You would have done the same," she said softly. "Yes," he agreed, his voice fading as exhaustion reclaimed him. "For you, I would." The words, perhaps not fully conscious, lingered in the room after he had drifted back to sleep. Rebecca remained at his side, pondering their significance as dawn broke over Evergreen Ranch. Over the next week, Mason's condition improved gradually under Rebecca's diligent care. His fever broke after 2 days, but the broken ribs kept him confined to bed or a chair by the fire. Rebecca divided her time between her regular duties and nursing him, reading to him when restlessness made him irritable, discussing books and ideas to keep his mind engaged. During this time of enforced proximity, the dynamic between them shifted subtly. Mason spoke more freely about his life before Colorado, his medical practice in Boston, his decision to abandon it after a devastating fire claimed the lives of patients he couldn't save. "I couldn't face another operating theater after that," he confessed one evening as they sat in his study, a chessboard between them. "Every time I picked up a scalpel, I saw their faces. So I left. Used my inheritance to buy land where I could rebuild something tangible. Something that grew rather than something that cut." Rebecca understood loss and the need to rebuild all too well. "And the correspondence with my father? Did that continue after you came west?" Mason's expression softened. "For a time. His letters always restored my faith in knowledge, in healing in its broader sense. He had a way of seeing purpose, even in tragedy. He moved a chess piece, his knight capturing her bishop. When the letters stopped, I feared the worst. That's when I began searching for him." Rebecca contemplated the board, then moved her queen. "Check," she said quietly. "He would have been grateful to know you came, even if it was too late for him." Mason studied both her and the board thoughtfully. "But not too late for you." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning beyond the simple statement. Rebecca felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire crackling nearby. As Mason recovered enough to resume light duties around the ranch, Rebecca found herself missing their quiet evenings together. She told herself it was natural. The companionship of an educated mind was rare in these parts. But in her heart, she knew it was more. One crisp October morning, Rebecca was in the garden harvesting the last of the season's vegetables when Abigail called to her from the porch. "Rider coming," the older woman announced, shading her eyes against the sun. Stranger by the look of him. Rebecca straightened, brushing dirt from her hands as she joined Abigail. In the distance, a lone horseman approached along the main road. Something about his posture seemed vaguely familiar, though she couldn't place why. "I'll fetch Mr. Reed," Abigail said, disappearing into the house. By the time the rider reached the yard, Mason had emerged and stood waiting, his stance protective, even as he maintained the appearance of casual welcome. Rebecca remained on the porch, curious but cautious. The man dismounted with the easy grace of someone accustomed to long hours in the saddle. He was perhaps 55, well-dressed in a city suit that looked out of place in the rugged surroundings. A gray bowler hat shaded a face that bore the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. "Mr. Reed?" he inquired, approaching with hand extended. "James Harrington, Esquire, at your service." Mason shook the offered hand briefly. "What brings you to Evergreen, Mr. Harrington?" "I represent a client with interest in some property formerly belonging to a Professor William Harper," Harrington explained smoothly. "I understand his daughter may be in your employ." Rebecca tensed, stepping forward, despite Mason's subtle gesture for her to remain back. "I'm Rebecca Harper," she said, descending the porch steps. "What interest could anyone have in my father's property?" Everything of value was sold to cover his medical expenses. Harrington turned to her with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Harper, a pleasure. My client is not interested in material possessions, but rather in academic papers and books that may have scholarly value. I'm prepared to offer a very generous sum for any remaining manuscripts, journals, or bare volumes from your father's collection." "Who is your client?" Mason asked, his tone deceptively casual. "I'm afraid I'm not at liberty to divulge that information," Harrington replied smoothly. "Client confidentiality, you understand, but I assure you the offer is legitimate and substantial." Rebecca exchanged a glance with Mason, seeing her own suspicion mirrored in his eyes. "My father's books were his most prized possessions," she said carefully. "The few I managed to keep have sentimental value beyond any monetary offer." Harrington's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps if I were to name a figure, $500 for any remaining books and papers. Surely that would ease any sentimental considerations." The sum was substantial, exactly matching the debt that had nearly cost Rebecca her freedom. The coincidence seemed too neat to be accidental. "That's very generous," Mason interjected before Rebecca could respond, "but I believe Miss Harper has made her position clear. The items are not for sale." Harrington's gaze hardened, though his tone remained polite. "I urge you to reconsider, Miss Harper. My client is most eager to preserve your father's academic legacy. This may be your only opportunity to ensure his work receives the recognition it deserves. If your client truly cared about my father's legacy, Rebecca replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart, they would have approached him while he lived, when recognition might have eased his final days. For a moment, something like genuine regret crossed Harrington's face. Perhaps so, nevertheless, should you change your mind, he reached into his coat and produced a calling card, which he handed to Rebecca. I'll be at the Greenwich Hotel until the end of the week. With a tip of his hat, he remounted his horse and departed, leaving Rebecca staring at the card in her hand. You don't trust him, Mason observed once Harrington was out of earshot. Do you? Rebecca countered. Not in the slightest. $500 is an unusually specific sum for books that haven't even been inventoried. Rebecca nodded, her thoughts exactly matching his. It's the amount of father's debt to Blackwood. The amount you paid to... She trailed off, unwilling to complete the sentence. To ensure your freedom, Mason finished for her, his tone gentle but direct. Yes, the coincidence seems unlikely. He took the calling card from her fingers, examining it closely. I'll make inquiries about Mr. Harrington. In the meantime, it might be wise to secure any of your father's papers you still possess. Rebecca thought of the small trunk in her room containing the few books and journals she had managed to save from Blackwood's seizure of their cottage. What could possibly be so valuable about father's academic work to warrant such interest now? Mason's expression was thoughtful. That, I think, is precisely what we need to discover. The next day brought another unexpected visitor to Evergreen Ranch, though this one far less welcome than the mysterious Mr. Harrington. Rebecca was helping Abigail prepare lunch when they heard the distinct sound of carriage wheels in the yard. Now who could that be? Abigail muttered, peering out the window. Her expression soured immediately. Margaret Fletcher and her girl, and the sheriff too, by the looks of it. Rebecca felt a flutter of apprehension. Sheriff Palmer? Why would he come with Mrs. Fletcher? Nothing good, I'd wager, Abigail replied grimly. Best fetch Mr. Reed. By the time Rebecca located Mason in the barn and returned with him to the house, their visitors had been grudgingly shown into the parlor by Abigail, who was serving tea with barely concealed annoyance. Margaret Fletcher sat rigidly on the edge of a settee, her elaborate dress and hat seeming absurdly formal in the practical surroundings of the ranch house. Beside her, Elizabeth Fletcher presented a picture of demure beauty in a pale blue dress that complemented her fair coloring. Sheriff Palmer, a heavy-set man with a drooping mustache, stood awkwardly by the fireplace, hat in hands. Mr. Reed, Margaret greeted Mason with a smile that didn't warm her calculating eyes. How kind of you to receive us without notice. We were simply passing by and thought we might pay a neighborly call. Mason's expression was politely skeptical as he entered, Rebecca a step behind him. Mrs. Fletcher, Miss Fletcher. Sheriff, this is unexpected. Mason, Sheriff Palmer nodded, clearly uncomfortable with whatever errand had brought him here. Ma'am, he added with a nod to Rebecca. I hope we find you recovered from your accident, Margaret continued, eyeing Mason with concern that seemed rehearsed. Elizabeth was quite distressed when we heard you'd been injured. Very distressed, Elizabeth echoed softly, raising her blue eyes to Mason's face with practiced vulnerability. As you can see, I'm much improved, Mason replied neutrally. Thanks in large part to Miss Harper's excellent care. Margaret's smile tightened at the mention of Rebecca. Yes, how fortunate that she was available. Though one does wonder about the propriety of such arrangements. Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks, but maintained her composure. Mason, however, stiffened visibly. If you've come to discuss propriety, Mrs. Fletcher, I suggest we dispense with pretense. What exactly brings you here today? And with the sheriff, no less. Margaret's facade of cordiality slipped. Very well, Mr. Reed. Blunt it shall be. There has been talk in town, concerning talk, about the nature of your relationship with Miss Harper, a young, unmarried woman living under the roof of a bachelor with no proper chaperone. It raises questions. Mrs. Cooper serves as chaperone, Mason replied evenly, and Miss Harper's reputation is beyond reproach, as is mine. Perhaps, Margaret conceded with a sniff, but appearances matter in civilized society. And there is also the matter of the man asking questions about Miss Harper in town. Rebecca exchanged a quick glance with Mason. What man? Sheriff Palmer cleared his throat uncomfortably. Fellow came through Greenwich few days back, Asking after a Miss Harper, daughter of a professor. Described you pretty accurate. Auburn hair, green eyes, early 20s. Did he give a name? Mason asked sharply. Called himself Thomas Harper, the sheriff replied. Said he was your brother, miss. Rebecca gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Thomas? That's impossible. My brother died in the war. Did he now? Margaret interjected with poorly concealed satisfaction. How curious that a dead man should be asking after his sister. What exactly did this man want? Mason pressed, placing a supportive hand on Rebecca's arm. Sheriff Palmer shrugged. Just information on where to find Miss Harper. Said he'd received word of his father's passing and was looking to reconnect with his sister. Rebecca's mind reeled. Thomas alive? It seemed impossible. She had received official notification of his death at Antietam 5 years earlier. Yet hope bloomed painfully in her chest at the possibility, however remote, that her brother might have survived. If he returns, Mason said to the sheriff, please direct him to Evergreen. Miss Harper would be most eager to determine if this man is indeed her brother. Margaret Fletcher made a small sound of disapproval. Which brings us back to the matter at hand. Mr. Reed, I speak as someone with your best interests at heart. Your position in this community, your reputation, these are valuable assets that could be irreparably damaged by scandal. Elizabeth and I thought perhaps. She trailed off, looking meaningfully at her daughter, who lowered her eyes modestly. What my mother means, Elizabeth said softly, is that I would be happy to invite Miss Harper to stay with us at Fletcher House until her situation is resolved. It would be much more proper than the current arrangement. The offer, thinly disguised as concern, was clearly intended to remove Rebecca from Mason's household. Rebecca felt a surge of indignation, but before she could respond, Mason spoke. That won't be necessary, he said firmly. Miss Harper's position here is entirely proper, and I have complete confidence in her character. As for any man claiming to be her brother, we'll address that matter if and when he presents himself. Margaret's lips thinned with displeasure. I see you are determined to disregard societal norms, Mr. Reed. I had hoped you might be more receptive to guidance, especially from those who have your advancement in mind. My advancement? Mason echoed, a hint of amusement in his tone. I wasn't aware I was seeking to advance anywhere beyond my own property, Mrs. Fletcher. Every man of ambition wishes to rise in society, Margaret replied stiffly, and a suitable marriage is often the most direct path. Elizabeth would make an exemplary wife for a man of your position. Elizabeth blushed prettily, though whether from embarrassment at her mother's bluntness or anticipation of Mason's response was unclear. Mason's expression remained impassive. I'm flattered by your consideration, Mrs. Fletcher, but my domestic arrangements are not open for community discussion or intervention. Now, if there's nothing else, I have ranch matters requiring my attention. The dismissal was polite but unmistakable. Margaret rose with as much dignity as her wounded pride would allow, Elizabeth following suit with a last lingering glance at Mason. Sheriff, will you escort us back to our carriage? Margaret requested, pointedly ignoring both Rebecca and Abigail, who had observed the exchange from the doorway. After they had departed, an uncomfortable silence fell over the parlor. Rebecca found herself unable to meet Mason's eyes, torn between gratitude for his defense and embarrassment at being the cause of such a scene. Well, by damn, Abigail said finally, breaking the tension. I believe lunch is ready, if anyone's still got an appetite after that display. Mason's lips quirked in a small smile. Thank you, Mrs. Cooper. We'll be along shortly. When Abigail had returned to the kitchen, Mason turned to Rebecca, his expression serious once more. I apologize for Mrs. Fletcher's presumption. She's been angling for a match between Elizabeth and myself since I arrived in Colorado. You needn't apologize for her behavior, Rebecca replied, finding her voice. Though I regret bringing complications to your household. You've brought nothing but competence and intelligent conversation, Mason countered firmly. Mrs. Fletcher's ambitions for her daughter are not your concern, nor should they affect your position here. Rebecca nodded, though a question lingered unasked between them. Finally, she gathered her courage. And the man claiming to be my brother, could it possibly be Thomas? Mason's expression softened. I don't know. The war created many confusions, misidentifications. It's possible. He was reported killed at Antietam, Rebecca said quietly, but they never recovered his. I never saw proof. Then we should prepare for the possibility that he survived, Mason said gently, and hope that this Thomas Harper is indeed your brother and not an impostor with less honorable intentions. Rebecca nodded, her mind wrestling with renewed hope and the fear of fresh disappointment. Thank you for defending me to Mrs. Fletcher, she said after a moment. Not many employers would have done so. I think we've moved beyond a simple employer-employee relationship, don't you? Mason replied, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart quicken. Before Rebecca could respond, Josiah appeared at the doorway, his weathered face apologetic for the interruption. Mr. Reed, one of the hands just rode in from the south pasture. Says there's a stranger camped by the creek, armed and looking like he's been on the trail a while. Mason's expression shifted immediately to concern. Not Harrington? No, sir, younger man. Ranch hand described him as military-like in bearing. Mason and Rebecca exchanged a quick glance. Thomas? She whispered, hope and fear warring in her voice. Possibly, Mason said cautiously. Josiah, have two of the men ride with me to investigate and ensure Miss Harper remains at the house until we determine who our visitor is. I should come with you, Rebecca protested. If it is Thomas, and if it's not, Mason countered gently, if it's someone using your brother's name for deception, let me assess the situation first. Though frustration burned in her, Rebecca recognized the wisdom in his caution. She nodded reluctantly. Be careful. Mason's expression softened. Always. As he departed with Josiah, Rebecca moved to the window, watching them mount up and ride toward the south pasture. The possibility that Thomas might be alive, might be so near after years of believing him dead, filled her with a tumultuous mixture of hope and dread. And beneath those emotions lurked another more confusing feeling. The realization that her place at Evergreen, and in Mason's life, might be profoundly altered by whatever they discovered at the creek. As Mason and his men rode toward the south pasture, Rebecca paced anxiously in the parlor. Abigail watched her with sympathetic eyes but offered no false reassurances. Both women understood the stakes. If the stranger truly was Thomas Harper, Rebecca's world would change dramatically. If not, the deception could harbor unknown dangers. Will you recognize him? Abigail asked finally, breaking the tense silence. Your brother, if it is him? Rebecca paused by the window, her fingers worrying the locket at her throat, the only keepsake she had of her family besides her father's books. I should. Thomas was 19 when he enlisted, 20 when he was reported killed. He'd be 30 now. She swallowed hard. But 5 years can change a person, especially if they've been through war. And if they've been through whatever kept him from finding you sooner, Abigail added gently. The thought had been haunting Rebecca as well. If this man was truly Thomas, where had he been for 5 years? Why had he not sought them out when their father was still alive? The questions multiplied, each bringing more anxiety than comfort. An hour passed with excruciating slowness. Rebecca tried occupying herself with mending, but kept pricking her fingers as her attention drifted. Finally, the sound of approaching horses drew her back to the window. Mason was leading the way, his expression unreadable. Behind him rode Josiah and another ranch hand, flanking a fourth rider, a lean man with military straight posture despite evident fatigue. His face was partially obscured by several days' growth of beard, but even at a distance, something about him sent a shock of recognition through Rebecca. She was at the door before they had fully dismounted, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. The stranger swung down from his horse with fluid grace that belied his weary appearance. When he turned toward the house, his eyes, the same clear green as Rebecca's own, locked on her face. Time seemed to suspend as they stared at each other across the yard. Rebecca searched the weathered features, looking past the beard and the hardness that hadn't been there before, seeking the brother she had mourned. Becca, the nickname, which only Thomas had ever used, broke the spell. Thomas? She whispered, scarcely daring to believe. He took a tentative step forward, then another. They told me you might not be expecting me. Rebecca's composure, maintained through auction blocks and storms, and Margaret Fletcher's insults, finally broke. With a sob, she ran forward, closing the distance between them. Thomas caught her in a fierce embrace, lifting her off her feet as he had when they were younger. They said you were dead, she cried against his shoulder. The army sent a letter. We held a memorial service. I nearly was, Thomas replied, his voice rough with emotion. Took a Confederate bullet at Antietam, spent months in a field hospital with no identification. By the time I recovered enough to remember my own name, the Army had already notified you. He set her down gently, holding her at arm's length to look at her. When I finally tracked down Father's last known address in Philadelphia, neighbors said you'd moved west. I've been following your trail ever since. Rebecca wiped tears from her cheeks. Father, he passed 3 months ago. Consumption. Pain flashed across Thomas's face. I feared as much when I heard about the auction in Greenwich. His gaze hardened as it shifted to Mason, who had been observing their reunion with respectful distance. Though I'm still trying to understand exactly what happened there. The subtle challenge in his tone reminded Rebecca that this reunion was taking place under unusual circumstances. Stepping back, she composed herself. Thomas, this is Mason Reed. She hesitated, unsure how to succinctly explain Mason's role in her life. He helped me after Father died. Mason stepped forward, extending his hand. Mr. Harper, you're welcome at Evergreen. Thomas accepted the handshake with visible wariness. Mr. Reed, I understand I have you to thank for my sister's current situation. The pause spoke volumes about his uncertainty regarding the nature of that situation. Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside, Mason suggested, indicating the house. You look like you could use a hot meal and a comfortable chair, Mr. Harper. Thomas nodded, though his guard remained up. Lead the way. In the kitchen, Abigail quickly prepared a hearty meal while Rebecca and Thomas sat at the table, Mason taking a position that respectfully acknowledged their need for family reunion while maintaining his presence as host. As Thomas ate with the careful restraint of a man long accustomed to rationing, Rebecca studied her brother. Beneath the trail dust and new lines on his face, she could still see the boy she had grown up with. Thoughtful, protective, carrying their father's love of literature alongside a pragmatism their scholarly patriarch had lacked. But there was something new as well, a hardness, a wariness that spoke of experiences beyond the battlefield. So, Thomas said finally, setting down his fork and addressing Mason directly, I heard interesting stories in Greenwich about how my sister came to be at your ranch, Mr. Reed. Mason met his gaze steadily. Imagine you did. Greenwich has a talent for colorful storytelling. They say you bought her, paid off Father's debt, and took her as property. Thomas's voice remained controlled, but his hand tightened around his coffee cup. Rebecca intervened quickly. That's not how it was, Thomas. Mr. Reed paid the debt, yes, but he immediately offered me choices, funds to travel elsewhere, or employment here. I chose to stay, to work as Mrs. Cooper's assistant. She gestured to Abigail, who had positioned herself protectively near the stove. I'm not property. I'm an employee. Thomas's skeptical expression softened slightly at his sister's earnest defense. And you've been treated well? With nothing but respect, Rebecca assured him. My reputation and safety have been Mr. Reed's concern from the beginning. Thomas turned back to Mason. That's quite the noble gesture, paying another man's debt with no expectation of return, particularly such a substantial sum. Mason's expression revealed nothing, but Rebecca noticed his fingers brush the pocket where he kept his watch, that unconscious tell she had observed before. I believed it was the right thing to do, Mason replied simply. And you just happened to be in Greenwich that night, at that particular saloon? Thomas pressed. A tense silence fell over the kitchen. Rebecca glanced between her brother and Mason, sensing the confrontation building beneath Thomas's polite interrogation. Thomas, she began cautiously. Mr. Reed knew Father. They had corresponded for years. Surprise flickered across Thomas's features. Did they now? Father never mentioned a Mason Reed to me. Your father saved my life during the Boston diphtheria outbreak of '68, Mason explained, his tone measured. We maintained a friendship through letters afterward. When they became infrequent, I grew concerned and tried to locate him. Thomas's expression shifted, suspicion giving way to thoughtful assessment. The diphtheria outbreak. I was away at school then. Father spent several months in Boston on what he called academic business. He studied Mason with new interest. So you came to Greenwich looking for William Harper and found his daughter being auctioned instead. Yes. Thomas absorbed this, his military-trained mind clearly recalibrating his understanding of the situation. And you felt you owed him a debt. I do, Mason corrected himself. Your father gave me more than just my life. He gave me purpose, direction. When I found Rebecca in that situation, he paused, choosing his words carefully. I couldn't stand by and watch his daughter suffer when I had the means to help. Rebecca felt a flush of warmth at Mason's words, though she noted he spoke of obligation rather than the deeper connection she had begun to hope might exist between them. Thomas seemed to detect something in Mason's tone as well. His gaze moved between them, assessing. I see, he said finally. Then to Rebecca's surprise, he smiled, a flash of the brother she remembered. Father always did have a gift for inspiring loyalty. The tension in the room eased perceptibly. Abigail seized the moment to offer more coffee and apple pie she had baked that morning, an offering that Thomas accepted with genuine appreciation. As the afternoon progressed into evening, Thomas shared details of his journey since the war, his long recovery in the field hospital, his search for identity and purpose afterward, and finally his determination to find what remained of his family. In turn, Rebecca told him of their father's final years, his declining health but undiminished spirit. He always believed you were alive, she said softly. Even after the official notification, he said he would have felt it if you were truly gone. Thomas's eyes glistened momentarily. I should have found you sooner. You're here now, Rebecca replied, squeezing his hand. That's what matters. Later, as Abigail prepared a guest room for Thomas, Mason invited them both to the library. Thomas whistled appreciatively at the extensive collection. Impressive for a ranch in Colorado territory, he remarked, running his fingers along the leather spines. Father would have approved. Speaking of Father's books, Rebecca said, seizing the opportunity, did you encounter a man named James Harrington during your time in Greenwich? He came here yesterday offering to buy any remaining books or papers of Father's. Thomas frowned. No, though I did hear talk of a city lawyer asking questions similar to mine. What was his interest in Father's work? Rebecca exchanged a glance with Mason. He claimed to represent someone interested in Father's academic contributions, willing to pay $500, precisely the amount of Father's debt. Thomas's expression hardened. That's suspiciously specific. Our thought exactly, Mason agreed. I intend to make inquiries about Mr. Harrington in Denver next week. Thomas nodded decisively. I'll join you. 2 sets of eyes and ears will serve better than one. He turned to Rebecca. In the meantime, perhaps we should examine whatever books and papers you manage to save. There might be a clue as to why someone would show such sudden interest in Father's work. Later that evening, after Thomas had retired to the guest room, Rebecca and Mason found themselves alone in the library. The events of the day, the Fletcher visit, Thomas's appearance, the mystery of Harrington's interest, had left them both reflective. He seems a good man, your brother, Mason observed, stoking the fire against the autumn chill. Protective of you. He always was, Rebecca replied with a small smile. Even when we were children. Mason nodded, his expression thoughtful. His arrival changes things for you. Rebecca felt a flutter of anxiety. How do you mean? You're no longer alone in the world, Mason said gently. You have family again. Options beyond Evergreen. The implication was clear. With Thomas's return, Rebecca's need for Mason's protection and employment might be diminished. The thought created an unexpected ache in her chest. Is that what you think I want? She asked quietly. To leave Evergreen now that Thomas is here? Mason's gaze met hers, and for once his careful composure slipped, revealing a vulnerability that matched her own. I wouldn't blame you if you did. Your position here began from necessity, not choice, my initial acceptance, perhaps, Rebecca acknowledged, but every day since has been my choice. She gathered her courage, stepping closer to him. I've stayed because I want to be here, Mason, not from obligation or necessity. The use of his given name, the first time she had addressed him so informally, hung between them, significant and transformative. Mason's expression softened, hope kindling in his eyes. Rebecca, he began, his voice low and sincere, I need you to know that while my actions may have begun from a sense of debt to your father, my feelings now. He hesitated, seemingly struggling to articulate emotions long kept in careful check. They have nothing to do with obligations and everything to do with who you are. Rebecca felt warmth bloom in her chest, spreading outward until she was certain she must be glowing with it. And who am I, Mason Reed? The most remarkable woman I've ever known, he answered without hesitation. Intelligent, compassionate, stronger than you realize. When I think of Evergreen now, I cannot imagine it without you. The words, simple but profound, stole Rebecca's breath. She had dared not hope for such an admission, had told herself that gratitude and mutual respect were enough. I feel the same, she whispered. This place, these people, you, they've become home to me in a way I hadn't thought possible again. Mason moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, see the firelight reflected in his eyes. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to retreat, he raised his hand to gently cup her cheek. Rebecca leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering closed momentarily. If Thomas hadn't returned, Mason said softly, I would have asked permission to court you properly. His arrival complicates matters. Rebecca met his gaze steadily. Only if we allow it to. Thomas wants my happiness, as father would have. Once he knows you better. The sound of a door closing upstairs interrupted her, reminding them both that they were no longer alone in the house. Mason stepped back reluctantly, his hand falling away from her face, though the warmth in his eyes remained. We should proceed carefully, he said, for your reputation, and to give Thomas time to form his own opinions. Rebecca nodded, understanding the wisdom in his caution, even as she longed to bridge the distance between them again. And what of Harrington? Do you truly believe there's something valuable in Father's papers? I don't know, Mason admitted, but $500 suggests whatever it is, someone wants it badly. When Thomas and I go to Denver, perhaps we'll learn more. And in the meantime? Mason smiled, the gentle expression transforming his usually serious features. In the meantime, Miss Harper, I believe we were in the middle of a chess game before all these interruptions. Your move, as I recall. Rebecca returned his smile, recognizing the offered normalcy for the gift it was, a chance to build their relationship on the foundation already established, adding this new understanding layer by layer with the patience worthy of something precious. My move indeed, Mr. Reed, she replied, moving toward the chess table. Though I warn you, I'm feeling particularly strategic this evening. As they settled into their familiar positions on either side of the board, Rebecca felt a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place like the chess pieces before them. Thomas's return, Harrington's mysterious offer, the Fletchers' machinations, all were challenges to be navigated. But for the first time since her father's death, she faced the future not with resignation, but with hope. The game began, but the true match, the delicate dance of hearts finding their way to each other despite obstacles, had been underway far longer than either had admitted until tonight. And like any worthy game of strategy, the most interesting moves were yet to come. The following week brought a flurry of activity to Evergreen Ranch. Thomas settled into the rhythm of ranch life with surprising ease, lending a hand with the cattle and proving himself an able horseman. Rebecca watched with quiet joy as her brother gradually relaxed, the vigilance of a soldier in hostile territory slowly giving way to something closer to peace. Mason, true to his word, maintained a respectful distance in Thomas's presence while continuing their evening chess matches and literary discussions when propriety allowed. These moments had taken on new significance since their conversation in the library. Each glance, each accidental brush of hands over a book or chess piece charged with unspoken understanding. On the morning Mason and Thomas were to depart for Denver, Rebecca rose before dawn to prepare provisions for their journey. She found Thomas already in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee as he studied a map by lamplight. You're up early, he observed, folding the map as she entered. Someone needs to ensure you don't subsist on hardtack and jerky for 3 days, Rebecca replied, placing a basket of freshly baked biscuits and wrapped sandwiches on the table. Thomas smiled, the expression softening the hard lines war and wandering had etched on his face. Always the caretaker. He hesitated, then added more seriously, I've been meaning to ask you about Reed. Rebecca busied herself with wrapping the food, her pulse quickening. What about him? I've been watching him, Becca, trying to understand his intentions. Thomas sipped his coffee thoughtfully. He's not what I expected. And what did you expect? Rebecca asked, meeting her brother's gaze directly. A man who purchases a woman, no matter the stated reason, usually has ulterior motives, Thomas said bluntly. I've seen it enough to be suspicious. Mason isn't like that, Rebecca replied with quiet certainty. Thomas studied her expression. No, I'm beginning to see that he isn't. He set down his cup. In fact, I'm beginning to wonder if his motives might be more honorable than I initially feared. Heat rose in Rebecca's cheeks. He's been nothing but respectful. I've noticed, Thomas said with a knowing half-smile, almost painfully so, particularly when I'm present. Before Rebecca could formulate a response, Mason entered the kitchen, dressed for travel. He nodded a greeting to Thomas, then turned to Rebecca. You didn't need to rise so early, he said, his tone formal, but his eyes conveying warmer sentiments. Consider it insurance against you two returning half-starved, Rebecca replied lightly. The provisions should last the entire journey. Your kindness is appreciated, Mason said, accepting the basket she handed him. Their fingers brushed briefly, and Rebecca felt that now familiar spark of connection. Thomas observed the exchange with a raised eyebrow, but made no comment. Instead, he rose and gathered his saddlebags. We should depart if we want to reach Denver by nightfall. Outside, in the crisp autumn dawn, Josiah had readied their horses. As Mason secured the provisions, Thomas drew Rebecca aside. I'll keep an eye on him, he promised, his protective instinct still evident despite his softening attitude toward Mason, and I'll find out what Harrington is after. Rebecca nodded gratefully. Be careful, both of you. Something about this situation feels precarious. Thomas squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. I survived Antietam and 3 years of wandering. I think I can handle a city lawyer. His expression grew more serious. And Becca, we'll talk about your situation here when I return. Properly. With that cryptic remark, he mounted his horse. Mason approached to say his goodbyes, his manner proper yet warm. We should return within 3 days, he told her. Josiah will oversee the ranch in my absence. But if anything concerns you, I'll manage, Rebecca assured him with a smile. This isn't my first time handling responsibilities. Mason's expression softened. No, it isn't. He hesitated, then added quietly, Take care, Rebecca. As they rode away, Rebecca stood watching until they disappeared beyond the ridge. Abigail joined her, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill. Men, the older woman sniffed, always riding off just when there's work to be done. Rebecca laughed, grateful for the distraction from her concerns. Then we'd better get to it ourselves, hadn't we? The day passed quietly, ranch chores filling the hours. By evening, Rebecca found herself restless, missing both her brother's rediscovered presence and Mason's quiet companionship. To occupy her tin, she decided to examine her father's remaining books and papers more thoroughly. In her bedroom, she unlocked the trunk containing the few possessions she had salvaged before Blackwood seized their cottage. The books inside, a well-worn Shakespeare folio, several volumes of poetry, a few medical texts, held sentimental rather than monetary value. Yet Harrington had offered a substantial sum for them. Beneath the books lay her father's journal, its leather cover cracked with age and use. William Harper had recorded his thoughts and observations throughout his academic career, though in his final years, weakness had reduced his entries to occasional brief notes. Rebecca settled on her bed and began to read, focusing on the entries from the period immediately before his death. Most contained poignant reflections on mortality, expressions of pride in his daughter, and regret over Thomas's presumed fate. Nothing seemed particularly valuable to an outside party, until she reached an entry dated just 2 weeks before his death. October 3rd, 1870, the deed arrived today from W.H. Perhaps this small legacy will provide for Rebecca after I am gone, though I have not told her of its existence for fear of raising false hopes. The land may be worthless, mere rocks and trees, or it may be the salvation I could not otherwise provide. I have hidden the document where only she might find it, should she remember our discussions of Wilde's novel, the secret place where Dorian kept his most precious and damning possession. Rebecca sat up straighter, her heart racing. W.H.? A deed to land? Her father had never mentioned owning property beyond their modest cottage. And what did Oscar Wilde's controversial novel have to do with it? Then it struck her. The picture of Dorian Gray, The portrait had been hidden behind a screen in Dorian's attic. Her father had discussed the symbolism with her during one of their literary evenings. And in their cottage in Greenwich, her father's attic had been a small nook under the eaves where he kept his most treasured books. Books that were now in this very trunk. With trembling hands, Rebecca examined each volume carefully. The Shakespeare folio, her father's most prized possession, drew her attention. It was unusually thick, even for a complete works. Turning it over, she noticed the binding had been expertly but detectably altered. Holding her breath, she carefully pried at the inside back cover. It gave way, revealing a hidden compartment within the binding. Inside lay a folded document, sealed with wax imprinted with the initials WH. Rebecca broke the seal with unsteady fingers and unfolded the paper. It was indeed a deed, transferring ownership of a parcel of land near Pikes Peak to William Harper. The previous owner's name caught her eye immediately. Whitaker Holdings, Limited WH. Not a person's initials, but a company. The date of transfer was just 3 months before her father's death, and the consideration listed was services rendered. No monetary value was specified. At the bottom, an annotation in her father's handwriting. The location corresponds to the map in my journal, page 42. Quickly, Rebecca flipped through the journal to the specified page. There she found a carefully drawn map showing a location in the mountains west of Colorado Springs. Her father had marked it with a small X and the notation, "The original survey confirms potential." Potential for what? Rebecca scoured the journal for additional clues, but found nothing explicit. Whatever potential the land held, her father had been deliberately vague about it, perhaps fearing the journal might fall into the wrong hands. A sudden thought struck her. $500, the exact amount of her father's debt, the sum Harrington had offered for his papers. What if the lawyer already knew about the deed? What if this mysterious land was worth far more than the debt it might have paid? Rebecca carefully refolded the deed and slipped it into her pocket. The mystery surrounding it and Harrington's interest had just deepened considerably. She needed to show this to Mason and Thomas when they returned. For now, she replaced the books in the trunk and locked it securely. Whatever secret her father had left her, she was determined to protect it until she understood its true value. The following day passed with agonizing slowness as Rebecca waited for Mason and Thomas to return. She kept the deed with her constantly, unwilling to risk it being discovered in her absence. By the second night, with no sign of the men, she began to worry. The journey to Denver and back should have taken 3 days at most, even accounting for their investigations. As she helped Abigail prepare dinner, her concern must have shown on her face. "They'll be fine," Abigail assured her, misreading the source of her anxiety, probably just delayed by business. Rebecca nodded, not wanting to share her discovery of the deed until Mason and Thomas returned. "I'm sure you're right." They had just sat down to eat when the sound of approaching horses drew them to the window. Rebecca's heart leaped with relief at the sight of 2 riders approaching in the gathering dusk. But as they drew closer, she realized with a chill that neither was Mason or Thomas. Josiah appeared at the back door, rifle in hand. "Stay inside, both of you," he ordered. "I don't recognize those men." Rebecca peered through the window as Josiah confronted the visitors in the yard. One was tall and lean, the other stockier, both dressed like typical frontiersmen. They appeared to be asking questions, gesturing toward the house. After a brief exchange, Josiah returned, his weathered face grave. "They're asking for you, Miss Harper. Say they have a message from your brother." Rebecca's blood ran cold. "Did they say what kind of message?" "No, but I don't like the look of them," Josiah replied. "I told them to wait outside." Rebecca considered her options. If Thomas had sent these men, refusing to receive them might mean missing important information, but something about the situation felt wrong. "Bring them to the porch," she decided. "I'll speak to them through the door." Josiah nodded approvingly at her caution. When the men were positioned on the porch, Rebecca approached the door, Abigail beside her with a loaded shotgun partially concealed in the folds of her skirt. "I understand you have a message from my brother?" Rebecca called through the closed door. "That's right, miss," the taller man replied, his tone affable but somehow false. "Thomas Harper asked us to tell you he and Mr. Reed have been delayed in Denver. They sent us ahead to escort you to them." Rebecca's suspicion deepened. Why would I need an escort to Denver? The men exchanged glances. They discovered something about your father's papers, the stockier one said. Something urgent. They need you to bring all his books and writings immediately. The mention of her father's papers sent a warning chill down Rebecca's spine. Neither Mason nor Thomas would have sent strangers to collect her or the documents, especially not after Harrington's suspicious interest. I'll need to prepare for the journey, she said, playing for time. Please wait while I gather what's needed. As soon as she stepped away from the door, she whispered urgently to Josiah, they're lying. Thomas and Mason would never send unknown men to collect me. Josiah nodded grimly. I thought as much. The taller one has a gun hidden under his coat. We need to get help, Rebecca said, or at least warn Mason and Thomas when they return. The ranch hands are scattered across the property, Josiah replied. By the time we gather them, these men might force their way in. Rebecca thought quickly. Is there a back way out of the house? The kitchen door, Abigail confirmed. It leads to the vegetable garden. From there, you could reach the woods unseen. I'll go for help, Rebecca decided. The Callahan Ranch is closest, about 3 miles east. Mr. Callahan could gather men and return before morning. Too dangerous, Josiah protested. You can't ride alone at night. We don't have a choice, Rebecca insisted. You and Mrs. Cooper need to keep those men occupied. Make them believe I'm gathering Father's papers. Give me as much time as you can. After a moment's hesitation, Josiah nodded. Take the bay mare from the small paddock behind the barn. She's quiet but fast. Rebecca squeezed his arm gratefully, then hurried to her room. She grabbed the deed, a warm shawl, and her father's journal, stuffing them into a small bag. From her drawer, she retrieved the small Derringer pistol Mason had given her for protection during her trips to town, a precaution that had seemed excessive until now. In the kitchen, Abigail pressed a packet of food into her hands. Be careful, child. I will. Rebecca hesitated, then added, if Mason and Thomas return before I do, tell them about the men. And tell them I found something in Father's books, a deed to land from Whitaker Holdings. Abigail nodded, memorizing the information. Godspeed. With a deep breath, Rebecca slipped out the back door into the darkening garden. She kept low, moving from shadow to shadow until she reached the small paddock Josiah had mentioned. The bay mare nickered softly as Rebecca approached. Quiet, girl, she whispered, quickly saddling the horse with practiced movements. Her father had insisted she learn riding and basic survival skills during their western travels, lessons she'd never been more grateful for than now. Mounting smoothly, Rebecca guided the mare along the tree line, keeping the ranch buildings between them and the front porch where the strangers waited. Only when she was well into the shelter of the woods did she urge the horse into a canter, heading east toward the Callahan property. The night was clear but moonless, making the journey treacherous. Rebecca relied on the mare's sure-footedness and her own memory of the terrain from previous visits. Every shadow seemed to harbor threats, every sound causing her heart to race. But she pressed on, determination overriding fear. She had covered perhaps 2 miles when she heard hoofbeats behind her, rapid and purposeful. Her ruse had been discovered. Panic surged through her, but she forced it down, focusing instead on the practical problem before her. The woods ahead thickened, offering better concealment but slower progress. To her right, an open meadow promised faster travel, but left her exposed. Making a split-second decision, Rebecca turned the mare toward the trees, hoping the denser cover would allow her to lose her pursuers. The forest closed around her like a protective cloak, branches reaching overhead to block what little starlight filtered down. Rebecca slowed the mare to a walk, knowing a fall in this darkness could prove fatal. The sounds of pursuit seemed to fade, then vanish altogether. For a moment, she allowed herself to hope she had evaded them. Then a twig snapped nearby, much too close, and a shadow detached itself from the darkness directly in her path. That's far enough, Miss Harper, came a familiar voice. Rebecca reined in sharply, her blood turning to ice as James Harrington stepped into a shaft of starlight, a pistol held casually in his gloved hand. Mr. Harrington, she managed, fighting to keep her voice steady. What an unexpected encounter. Not so unexpected, he replied smoothly. I've had men watching Evergreen Ranch since my visit. When Reed and your brother departed for Denver, it seemed an opportune moment to acquire what I came for. The deed, Rebecca stated, pieces falling into place. You knew about my father's land. Harrington inclined his head in acknowledgement. Smart girl. Yes, the deed from Whitaker Holdings. I'd hoped to obtain it more discreetly, but you've forced my hand. How did you know about it? Rebecca demanded, stalling while she assessed her options. The Derringer was in her pocket, but Harrington's pistol was already drawn. Whitaker Holdings is owned by Luther Blackwood, Harrington explained, seeming almost amused by her questions. He transferred that deed to your father in a moment of weakness, or perhaps cunning. William Harper had discovered something that could have destroyed Blackwood. Rebecca's mind raced. What could my father possibly have discovered? Evidence of fraud on a massive scale, Harrington replied. Your scholarly father had an unexpected talent for accounting. He uncovered Blackwood's scheme to manipulate land titles throughout the territory, including that parcel near Pikes Peak, which happens to sit atop a very promising gold vein. The revelation staggered Rebecca. Her father, the literary professor, had stumbled upon a criminal conspiracy. So the deed was what? Blackwood's way of buying his silence? Precisely, a rather elegant solution, until your father's untimely death brought it back into play. Harrington stepped closer, his pistol unwavering. Now, Miss Harper, the deed, if you please. Rebecca's hand moved toward her pocket, but instead of retrieving the deed, she pulled out the Derringer and aimed it directly at Harrington. I think not, Mr. Harrington. The lawyer's eyebrows rose in surprise, then admiration. Well, well, the professor's daughter has spirit. His own pistol remained steady. Unfortunately, you seem to have brought a Derringer to a gunfight, my dear. Perhaps, Rebecca acknowledged, her voice steadier than she felt. But at this range, even a Derringer rarely misses. Shall we test which of us is the faster shot? Tension crackled between them, neither willing to back down. Then the silence of the forest was broken by approaching riders, multiple horses moving at speed. Harrington's expression tightened. It seems we have company. This isn't over, Miss Harper. Before Rebecca could respond, he backed away into the shadows, disappearing as silently as he had appeared. Moments later, 3 riders burst into the small clearing, lanterns held high. Rebecca! Mason's voice, tight with worry, was the sweetest sound she had ever heard. Here, she called, lowering the Derringer with shaking hands. I'm here. Mason was off his horse in an instant, striding toward her with Thomas and another man, Sheriff Palmer from Greenwich, close behind. Are you hurt? Mason demanded, his eyes scanning her for injuries. No, Rebecca assured him, fighting the urge to collapse against him in relief. But Harrington was just here. He's after Father's deed. Thomas moved to her other side protectively. We know. We uncovered the whole scheme in Denver. Blackwood's been manipulating land titles, Mason explained quickly, helping Rebecca dismount. Your father discovered the fraud and confronted him. The deed was Blackwood's attempt to silence him. Harrington just told me, Rebecca said, still trembling slightly from the confrontation. He's working for Blackwood. Sheriff Palmer stepped forward. Been tracking Harrington for months. He's Blackwood's fixer, cleans up his messes, legal and otherwise. He tipped his hat to Rebecca. Begging your pardon, miss, but you're lucky to be alive. Harrington ain't known for leaving witnesses. There are men at the ranch, Rebecca said urgently. 2 of them, claiming you sent them to escort me to Denver. Mason's face darkened. Josiah and Mrs. Cooper. They were helping me escape, Rebecca explained, but they're still there, and if Harrington returns, we need to get back, Thomas said, already remounting his horse. Sheriff, can you track Harrington? Palmer nodded grimly. I'll find him. You folks get back to your ranch. Mason helped Rebecca onto his own horse, mounting behind her. The protective circle of his arms as he took the reins sent a wave of warmth through her, despite the danger. Hold tight, he murmured in her ear as they set off at a gallop. The ride back to Evergreen was a blur of moonlight and shadow, the urgency lending speed to their journey. As they approached the ranch, Rebecca was relieved to see lights still burning in the windows, a sign that life continued within. They found Josiah on the porch, rifle across his knees, blood darkening the sleeve of his shirt. About time you folks showed up, he greeted them gruffly. You're hurt, Rebecca exclaimed, dismounting quickly. Just a graze, the old ranch manager dismissed. Them fellas didn't take kindly to being misled. Got one of them in the leg before they rode off. Inside, they found Abigail unharmed but shaken, a shotgun still clutched in her hands. Thank the Lord you're all safe, she breathed, embracing Rebecca fiercely. While Mason tended to Josiah's wound, Rebecca recounted her encounter with Harrington and his revelations about Blackwood and her father. We learned similar information in Denver, Thomas confirmed. Blackwood's been running a land fraud scheme for years. The deed father received is for a parcel containing a significant gold deposit, worth far more than the $500 Harrington offered. But why did father keep it secret, Rebecca wondered. He could have used it to pay his debts. The deed wasn't officially recorded, Mason explained, finishing Josiah's bandage. Your father likely knew that if he tried to sell or mortgage the land, Blackwood would challenge its legitimacy. It was a standoff. Blackwood couldn't reclaim the deed without admitting to the original fraud. Thomas nodded. Father probably intended to tell you about it when he could also provide guidance on how to use it. His illness may have progressed faster than he expected. Rebecca withdrew the deed from her pocket, studying it with new understanding. So this piece of paper is what everyone's been after. And they're still after it, Mason said gravely. Harrington won't give up, especially now that we know about the fraud. Too much at stake. So what do we do? Rebecca asked, looking between her brother and Mason. Thomas's expression was determined. We bring evidence of the fraud to the territorial governor. With Sheriff Palmer's testimony and the deed as proof, we can stop Blackwood permanently. But first, Mason added, we need to secure your safety. He turned to Rebecca, his eyes serious. I think it's time we discussed your future and what you want it to be. The next morning found them gathered in Mason's study, Rebecca, Thomas, and Mason, the deed spread on the desk between them. The land is legitimately yours, Mason confirmed after examining the document carefully. Despite the circumstances of its acquisition, the transfer appears legally binding. Which means, Thomas added, you have options, Becca, real options, for perhaps the first time since father fell ill. Rebecca looked between the two men, her brother miraculously restored to her, and Mason, whose presence in her life had come to mean more than she could have imagined the night he'd rescued her at the Golden Horn. What kind of options? She asked quietly. Thomas leaned forward. You could sell the land, not to Blackwood, obviously, but to a legitimate mining company. It would provide enough for you to go anywhere, do anything. Open that school you always talked about, perhaps. Or, Mason said, his voice carefully neutral, you could develop it yourself. Hire experienced people to extract the gold responsibly. Build something lasting. Rebecca heard the unspoken message in his words, that she could build a future here, in Colorado, near Evergreen, near him. I need time to consider, she said finally. But first we need to deal with Blackwood and Harrington. They won't stop coming after the deed. Sheriff Palmer suggested we meet him in Greenwich tomorrow, Thomas said. He's gathering evidence from other victims of Blackwood's schemes. With enough testimony, the territorial governor will have to act. Mason nodded. It's our best chance to end this definitively. He hesitated, then added more gently, Rebecca, perhaps you should remain here while Thomas and I— No, she interrupted firmly. This involves my father, my inheritance. I'm coming with you. The determination in her voice brooked no argument. After a moment, both men nodded their acceptance. Then we leave at first light, Mason decided, and we'll be prepared for what awaits us in Greenwich. That evening, as preparations for their journey were completed, Rebecca found herself drawn to the library. The room had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where she and Mason had built their connection through shared appreciation of literature and ideas. She was not entirely surprised when Mason joined her there after dinner, closing the door softly behind him. I wanted to speak with you alone, he said without preamble, before tomorrow's confrontation. Rebecca set aside the book she hadn't really been reading. What is it? Mason crossed to stand before her, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. Tomorrow we face considerable danger. Before we do, I need you to know something with absolute clarity. He took a deep breath. My feelings for you have nothing to do with obligation to your father and everything to do with who you are, Rebecca Harper. I have grown to care for you more deeply than I believed possible after years of keeping the world at arm's length. Rebecca's heart seemed to swell within her chest. Mason, please, he said softly, let me finish. I know your circumstances have changed dramatically. Thomas's return, the deed, the possibilities it opens for you. I would never presume to limit those possibilities. But if, after all this is resolved, You find your heart inclined toward a future that includes Evergreen, that includes me. I would consider it the greatest blessing of my life." The simple, heartfelt declaration moved Rebecca beyond words. Rising from her chair, she closed the distance between them, placing her hands gently on his chest. "When I first came to Evergreen," she said, her voice soft but steady, "I was determined to work off my debt and move on, to reclaim independence after months of feeling helpless. I never expected to find a home here. I never expected to find you." Mason's hands came up to cover hers, warm and steady. "And now?" "Now I know that true independence isn't about standing alone," Rebecca said. "It's about choosing freely where and with whom to stand." She met his gaze directly. "I choose Evergreen. I choose you, Mason Reed." The joy that transformed his features was answer enough, but the gentle kiss that followed sealed the promise between them, a promise of shared future, freely chosen by both. When they finally parted, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "We should tell Thomas," he said, "before tomorrow." Rebecca nodded. "Yes, though I suspect he's already guessed." A discreet cough from the doorway confirmed her suspicion. Thomas stood there, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I came to discuss tomorrow's plans," he said, not bothering to hide his amusement. "But I see you two have more important matters to settle." Rebecca felt herself blush but didn't move away from Mason. "Thomas, Her brother raised a hand, his expression softening. "No explanations needed, Becca. I've watched you both these past days. What's between you is real and honest, something rare in this world." He directed his gaze to Mason. "I assume your intentions are honorable, Reed?" "Entirely," Mason confirmed, standing tall beside Rebecca. Thomas nodded, satisfied. "Then you have my blessing, for whatever that's worth. Father would have approved, I think. He always did value intellect and character above all else." The simple acceptance meant more to Rebecca than elaborate congratulations might have. "Thank you," she said softly. Thomas shrugged, though his eyes were warm. "Just be happy, little sister. After everything, you deserve that much." He sobered slightly. "Now, about tomorrow, we should discuss how to handle Blackwood and Harrington." As they settled into planning, Rebecca felt a profound sense of rightness. Whatever dangers tomorrow might bring, tonight she was surrounded by the two people who mattered most in the world, her future clearer than it had been in years. Greenwich looked different to Rebecca as they rode into town the following morning. Less threatening, more mundane. The Golden Horn, where her nightmare and salvation had begun, was just a shabby saloon in the harsh light of day. Even the imposing facade of Blackwood's bank seemed diminished somehow. Sheriff Palmer met them outside his office, his expression grim. "Got 7 folks willing to testify about Blackwood's land swindles," he reported, "including the former owner of that parcel near Pikes Peak, man named Jenkins, who was forced to sell to Whitaker Holdings after Blackwood called in his loans." "And Harrington?" Mason asked. "No sign of him since last night," the sheriff admitted. "But I've got deputies watching the bank and Blackwood's home." Their plan was straightforward. Confront Blackwood with the evidence, offer him the choice between surrender or public exposure, and let the territorial justice system handle the rest. Rebecca carried the deed securely in an inner pocket of her jacket, its presence a tangible reminder of her father's final legacy. As they approached the bank, Rebecca felt a chill of foreboding. The building seemed too quiet, the street too empty for mid-morning in a busy frontier town. "Something's wrong," Thomas murmured, his soldier's instincts alert. Sheriff Palmer nodded, hand moving to his gun. "Stay close." They entered the bank cautiously. The usual tellers were absent, the counter deserted. Only a single figure occupied the space. Luther Blackwood himself, seated behind his massive desk as if awaiting their arrival. "Ah, Miss Harper," he greeted her with the same oily smile he had worn the night of the auction. "And Mr. Reed, how predictable." "Mr. Blackwood," Sheriff Palmer stepped forward. "I'm here on official business concerning allegations of fraud and manipulation of land titles." Blackwood's smile didn't falter. "Serious charges, Sheriff. I assume you have evidence?" "We have the deed you transferred to William Harper," Rebecca stated, her voice steady despite the hatred she felt for this man who had nearly sold her to pay her father's debts. "And witnesses to your other fraudulent dealings." "Ah, yes, the deed. Blackwood sighed theatrically. A regrettable lapse in judgment on my part. Sentiment, you see. Your father was most persuasive about his daughter's future. Spare us the performance, Thomas cut in. Where's Harrington? As if summoned by the question, the lawyer emerged from a back office, flanked by two armed men, the same ones who had come to Evergreen. But it was the figure behind them that caused Rebecca's breath to catch. Margaret Fletcher, elegant and cold as ever, stepped into view. Mr. Reed, she greeted Mason with icy politeness. What a disappointment you have proven to be. Mason's expression revealed surprise, but not shock. Mrs. Fletcher, I suspected someone local was involved in Blackwood's schemes, but I admit you weren't my first guess. Few ever look beyond my social standing to see the business acumen beneath, she replied with brittle pride. Whitaker Holdings is as much mine as Luther's. A woman must secure her future in this world, Mr. Reed, a lesson Miss Harper might have benefited from learning earlier. Rebecca felt understanding dawn. That's why you were so insistent about my propriety at Evergreen. You wanted Mason for your daughter, and me out of the way. Elizabeth deserves a husband of quality and means, Margaret replied unapologetically. Your presence complicated matters unnecessarily. Enough social niceties, Harrington interrupted, his patience visibly thin. The deed, Miss Harper. Now. Sheriff Palmer moved to draw his gun, but one of Harrington's men already had his weapon leveled. I wouldn't, Sheriff. A tense standoff ensued, the air thick with unspoken threats. Rebecca felt Mason shift slightly, positioning himself between her and the armed men. There are witnesses outside, Thomas said calmly, though Rebecca could see the tactical assessment in his eyes. Deputies, if anything happens to us, you'll hang. An unfortunate bank robbery, Blackwood suggested smoothly. Tragic, but not uncommon in these wild territories, especially when one of the robbers is a former soldier, known to be unstable after his war experiences. He nodded toward Thomas meaningfully. The cold calculation behind the threat chilled Rebecca to the bone. These people had planned for everything, including murder if necessary. The deed isn't worth killing for, she said, playing for time while her mind raced for solutions. On the contrary, Harrington replied, the gold in that claim is worth a small fortune. But more importantly, that deed links Blackwood to the larger fraud. We can't allow that evidence to reach the territorial governor. Rebecca glanced at Mason, seeing in his eyes the same desperate calculation. They were outnumbered, outgunned. Yet surrender meant not only losing the deed, but likely their lives as well. In that moment of silent communication, a commotion erupted outside. Shouts, the thunder of hooves, a gunshot. Everyone in the bank froze, attention diverted to the street. The distraction provided the opening Mason needed. With lightning speed, he drew the Derringer concealed in his sleeve and fired at Harrington. The small caliber bullet struck the lawyer's shoulder, sending him stumbling backward with a cry of pain. Simultaneously, Thomas launched himself at one of the armed men, knocking his gun aside as Sheriff Palmer drew his own weapon and took aim at the second thug. Chaos erupted. Rebecca ducked behind a counter as Blackwood reached for a shotgun hidden beneath his desk. Margaret Fletcher shrieked, diving for cover. The bank's doors burst open, and a familiar voice rang out, "Drop your weapons, now!" Rebecca peered over the counter to see Josiah and 3 Evergreen ranch hands standing in the doorway, rifles trained on the room's occupants. Behind them, more men poured in, locals she recognized from Breenage, armed and determined. The witnesses we gathered, Sheriff Palmer explained with grim satisfaction. Turns out they were mighty interested in seeing justice done personally. Blackwood, seeing his advantage evaporate, slowly raised his hands. Harrington, clutching his bleeding shoulder, glared with impotent fury. "It's over, Luther," one of the townsmen said, the former owner of Rebecca's land claim, she realized. "We're taking back our town." As Sheriff Palmer and the deputies moved to secure Blackwood and his accomplices, Rebecca emerged from her hiding place. Mason immediately came to her side, his eyes searching her for injury. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently. "No," she assured him, grasping his hands tightly. "You?" "I'm fine," he promised, relief evident in his voice. Thomas joined them, a cut on his cheek but otherwise unharmed. "Josiah," he said with admiration, "your timing is impeccable." The old ranch manager shrugged modestly. "Figured you folks might need backup." gathered some hands, and rode hard. As Blackwood and the others were led away, Rebecca felt a profound sense of closure. Her father's discovery, which had cost him so dearly, had finally brought his enemies to justice. "What happens now?" she asked, looking between Mason Thomas and the sheriff. Sheriff Palmer adjusted his hat thoughtfully. "Blackwood and Harrington will stand trial for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. With the evidence we've gathered and the witnesses willing to testify, I'd say they're bound for territorial prison for a good long while." "And the deed?" Rebecca asked. "Legal as the day it was signed," the sheriff confirmed. "That land is yours, Miss Harper, free and clear." Later, as they stood on Breenage's main street watching Blackwood and his conspirators loaded into a prison wagon bound for Denver, Rebecca felt Mason's hand slip into hers. "I believe," he said quietly, "we have a future to discuss." She smiled up at him, the weight of the past finally lifting from her shoulders. "Yes, we do." Thomas, observing them with brotherly affection, clapped Mason on the shoulder. "I'm thinking Evergreen Ranch might need another pair of hands," he suggested. "Someone to help while you two sort things out." The offer to stay, to be part of their lives, brought tears to Rebecca's eyes. "You're sure?" she asked her brother. "After all your wandering?" Thomas's smile was peaceful, the restlessness that had driven him for years seemingly settled. "I've found what I was looking for, Becca. Family, purpose, a place to belong. Isn't that what we all want in the end?" As they mounted their horses for the ride home to Evergreen, Rebecca felt a sense of completion she had not experienced since before her father's illness. The deed in her pocket represented not just land or gold, but freedom. The freedom to choose her own path, to build a life with the man riding beside her, to create a future unburdened by the past. "Home?" Mason asked simply. "My name is simply," his eyes full of promise. Rebecca nodded, her heart full. "Home." Together they rode toward Evergreen Ranch, toward the future that awaited them there, built on foundations of honor, courage, and love that had withstood the harshest tests and emerged stronger for the trials endured. The debt of honor that had brought them together had been paid in full, and in its place had grown something far more precious, a bond freely chosen, a love that would endure beyond obligation to become their greatest treasure. 1 year later, Evergreen Ranch glowed in the spring sunshine. Wildflowers dotted the fields, and colorful banners strung between the cottonwood trees created a picturesque setting for the special day. In the upstairs bedroom, Rebecca stood before the mirror as Abigail carefully adjusted the veil over her auburn hair. The wedding dress was simple yet elegant, made from ivory silk that complemented her natural beauty. "Father would be proud," Thomas said, leaning against the doorframe, his expression full of emotion. "And approving, too." Rebecca smiled through the thin veil. "I think so. Mason represents everything he valued: intelligence, kindness, honor." Thomas stepped forward, offering his arm. "Ready, Becca?" In front of the house, simple chairs had been arranged in rows on the lawn. The entire small community was present. The Callahan family, the witnesses from Breenage, who had helped them defeat Blackwood, and of course, the loyal workers of Evergreen. Sheriff Palmer stood slightly to one side, hat in hand, clearly unaccustomed to formal attire. Mason waited beneath an arch of flowers erected under an ancient oak tree, with Josiah beside him, serving as best man. His nervousness vanished when Rebecca appeared on Thomas's arm. He saw only her, the woman who had changed his life with her intelligence, strength, and compassion. The town minister, who had once known Professor Harper, performed a simple yet profound ceremony. As Mason and Rebecca exchanged wedding rings, hers crafted from the first gold extracted from their land, their vows rang clear and steady in the spring air. "I, Mason, take you, Rebecca, to be my wife, not out of debt or obligation, but from complete love. I promise to stand with you through prosperity and hardship, in wealth and in poverty, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish you until death do us part." Rebecca's eyes glistened with tears as she responded, "I, Rebecca, take you, Mason, to be my husband. By free choice and with my whole heart, I promise to stand with you through all of life's journeys, building a future founded on respect, friendship, and unconditional love, until death do us part." The celebration afterward was a jubilant spring feast, with violin music from one of the ranch hands, abundant food from Abigail's kitchen, and much laughter. As twilight descended, Mason drew Rebecca away from the crowd. "I have a wedding gift for you," he said, leading her to a quiet corner of the property. There, a small, newly constructed building stood among young trees, a schoolhouse. "Mason," Rebecca gasped, emotion welling up as she realized what it was. "The doors will be open to anyone who wishes to learn," he explained, pride evident in his voice. "Children of ranch workers, youngsters from neighboring farms, anyone who thirsts for knowledge. You'll be the teacher, like your father before you." Rebecca embraced him, too moved for words. In that moment, she felt her father's presence, not in grief or loss, but in joy and continuation. 3 years later, Evergreen Ranch flourished. The land near Pikes Peak, under the responsible management of Mason and Thomas, had yielded enough gold to secure their future and invest back into the community. The school had expanded, now with 2 classrooms and a small library named after William Harper. On a warm autumn afternoon, Rebecca sat on the porch, watching Mason teach their 2-year-old son, William, how to feed the horses. She lovingly caressed her second child growing within her, a girl she sensed due to arrive in winter. Thomas had built a small ranch adjacent to theirs, creating an extended family community. Surprisingly, it was Elizabeth Fletcher who had become his wife, an unexpected outcome after her mother's downfall. Elizabeth had proven herself entirely different from Margaret, with a kind heart and independent spirit that she had previously not been allowed to express. Greenwich had changed as well. With Blackwood and Harrington in prison, the bank was now owned by an elected town council. Those who had been victims of fraud had reclaimed their land or received compensation. Josiah approached the porch, handing Rebecca a letter. "From Denver Medical Schools," he said, "about your husband's proposal." Rebecca opened the letter, her smile widening as she read the contents. Mason had agreed to spend 1 day each week teaching medicine to a small group of students. He had finally found a way to reconcile his past with his present, to heal without abandoning the life he had built. As Mason carried William toward her, Rebecca felt a completeness she had never imagined possible. The debt of honor had been paid, not just between Mason and her father, but to herself, to William Harper, to this land, and to all the others whose fates had intertwined with theirs. They were no longer bound by the past, but free to build the future, a future based on choices they had made together, with love, respect, and faith in each other's capabilities. "What are you reading?" Mason asked as he sat beside her, William dozing against his shoulder. Rebecca handed him the letter, resting her head against his shoulder, careful not to disturb the boy. "A new chapter," she answered simply, "of many more to come." Mason kissed her forehead, and they sat together, looking out over their ranch, their family, and their future. All that the debt of honor had opened the door to, but that love had preserved and made flourish.